Diane Montagna, who is from LifeSite News. I assume everyone here knows about LifeSite News. Yeah, LifeSite to me, I always say, you know, they're just doing such great work that, you know, as much as I want to say that what we do is better and more important and give us money and all that, I mean, it's an honor for the Remnant team to be allied with our friends at LifeSite News, and Diane certainly brings a lot of firepower to this. And what I said last year is the same with Diane, in that she's in Rome, she's reporting, she's trying to do what journalists do, which is report accurately, not to sensationalize, not to just blog everybody to death with wild predictions and everything else. And I think that's what the CIC needs to have every year, is someone like Diane Montagna to come in here, tell us what's going on, so that we can effectively become foot soldiers and sort of put together game plans in our own parishes and communities based on what the facts are. So we're really, really pleased and honored. You can see Diane's bio, some points up here. Check those out as we begin here. But she's coming all the way from Rome. She's a local girl, more or less, but lives in Rome, and so making great sacrifice to be here with us and to bring us, as I say, the real facts about what's happening. Please help me welcome Diane Montagna.
Which mic am I concentrating?
That one, yeah.
This one, okay. All right, well, thank you, Michael, for your very kind introduction. And thank you to the organizers and for everyone who's made this event possible. And thank you to all of you for being here and for your prayers and for seeking to live a life of holiness in your particular state of life. After a month of Synod antics in Rome, I feel as if we should be taking a vote at the end of the conference. But I need to produce a document that you don't understand, both in content or language. I would like to preface my talk by saying that my intention today is to focus primarily on the facts and to offer you a snapshot of what's been happening in Rome in recent months. I'm going to situate my talk between two important events. The first, perhaps more important than the latter. The first being Archbishop Vigano's extraordinary testimonies. And on the latter, the other bookend, the Synod on Young People, the Faith, and Vocational Discernment, which just concluded last Sunday. I'm also going to be relying on some recent conversations I've been having just this week with high-ranking prelates, priests, and informed lay sources in Rome in order to give you a better understanding of what's lying ahead. Of course, as many of the conversations that I've needed to have happened after the Synod, it wasn't easy or really possible to write this talk in advance. Unlike the third part of the Synod final document, which was probably in the fridge for about a year. So before I begin, I want to stress, with that aside, that what I'm about to say is primarily not a matter of my own personal opinion, and much less any personal criticism of my own. Before I begin, as a Vatican journalist, it's not easy these days to cover the Vatican. I've read a lot of St. Catherine of Siena in my life, and it has really served me well, because I don't find anger in my heart. Maybe there should be in terms of what's happening now, but I do find myself more than ever before praying for the church, praying for the Lord's church, and I think that's the strongest weapon that we have in this battle. But I want to give you just an idea of the deepening crisis. So finally, as I'm fresh from the heart of the ecclesiastical storm in Rome, if after my talk it seems like a torrent has just hit, welcome to the world of a Rome correspondent under the present pontificate. So let's begin. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about the general mood in the Vatican these days. It's hard to get a real feel for what's going on behind the walls these days, as many officials are afraid and have become increasingly tremulous about speaking to the media. But according to some sources, the mood in the Vatican is one of low morale and discouragement, unless you are a member of the Pope's inner circle. One high-ranking prelate told me recently, Quote, "There's great discouragement, especially regarding the response to the declarations of Archbishop Vigano and the response to the situation with Theodore McCarrick in the United States. Many people are profoundly discouraged and even feel abandoned by the lack of any action on the part of the Holy See." Quote, "In the Curia, there's a constant atmosphere of fear and people trying to protect themselves," he said. Another source close to the Vatican recently told me, quote, "It's a reign of terror under the dear leader." He's just like Perón, acclaimed by the masses and resented by his court. Yet one Vatican official said, and I know this Vatican official well, he said he's convinced that the Pope is a true son of the Church, loves Christ and loves the Church. And he knows this by working with the Pope up close. In papal meetings with important visitors, he said he has seen the Pope listen intently and be deeply moved by some of the things that these visitors have told him. Quote, "He comes across as very humble and engaged," he said. But as another source pointed out, this official only saw him in those occasions. And as we know, there are others when he has been said to, quote, "boil with rage," particularly when publicly criticized and publicly corrected. So moving on to one of your favorite people probably, if I can read this crowd well, and that's Archbishop Vigano. You're all aware of Archbishop Vigano's 3 testimonies following the McCarrick revelations, so I won't dwell on them here, except to say that his first testimony was, quote, "a bullet right between the eyes," according to one source. According to informed sources, most of the U.S. bishops, and probably those further afield, believe him to be telling the truth. Having met him and been in touch with him, I have no doubt that he has the interests of the Church solely at heart. At LifeSite, in addition to breaking his extraordinary 11-page testimony, we were responsible for helping Archbishop Vigano to set the record straight on 2 issues in this shameless attack to discredit him, rather than deal with the deeply problematic issues that he raised. I won't go into detail here, but we provided the full picture about allegations that he had halted an investigation into Archbishop Neinstadt, which wasn't true. And we fully reported on what really happened when Pope Francis met privately with Kim Davis. And I think that anyone who has followed this and followed the Archbishop Vigano affair will quickly recognize that he acquitted himself very, very well. I would also add that while Archbishop Vigano has been in touch with media that he trusts, that doesn't mean that there's a, quote, "political plot afoot," as Cardinal Ouellet claimed in his October 7th open letter. And as a side note, I'll get into the issue of a translation problem that emerged during the Youth Synod. But it's interesting to note that the Vatican managed to release Cardinal Ouellet's letter in 4 major languages on a Sunday. But here, I digress. One could argue regarding the Archbishop, especially the original 11-page testimony, that there may have been some strategic benefits had Archbishop Vigano given it to a leftist publication, like America Magazine. Could have been better strategically, and an argument could have been made for that. But that's a prudential judgment that's up for debate. What I can confirm is that there was no right-wing conservative plot, as a number of fake news outlets have reported. Archbishop Vigano trusted that we would get the news out, and we did. Having met him a few times and been in contact with him, there's no doubt that he's a very kind man with a very deeply priestly heart. He's not doing this out of revenge. This cost him a great deal. As you know, he's now in hiding. I have been told the decision to remain in an undisclosed location was likely made first for strategic reasons, to manage the situation. But I also know that was made out of a genuine, and I would say well-founded concern for his safety. There are powerful people involved in this. And here, if Tess would cue the photo. As an aside, I just saw this on Twitter last night, and perhaps some of you have too as well. But heaven seems to have shown support for Archbishop Vigano, because a V-shaped lightning strike hit the cupola of St. Peter's Basilica last week. Michael, maybe you could add that to the t-shirt. So now I'm going to move to the youth, what I've termed a youth synod and fallout. So let's turn to the synod on young people, the faith and vocational discernment. Although the faith and the vocational discernment did not seem to come into it too much. And, yeah, anyway. So as you may be aware, during the youth synod, as it's been called, although youth is really a term for young boys, so we were calling it a youth synod, but we shouldn't have been, because that's not really the proper term. But there were reports of machinations and manipulation. They've only recently emerged, but as in the family synods, of course, we have the whole book on the rigging of a Vatican synod, ? But we're only now hearing a little bit about the machinations in this synod. Some people said it was actually worse. Several people said to me, and I think this is true, that the synod organizers really learned from the last synod, and so they built into the recipe certain things that shut it down more for the media and gave us less access to the bishops and such. But anyway, the greatest insight today is contained in a new interview with Archbishop Anthony Fisher of Sydney, Australia. It was just published by Edward Penton in the National Catholic Register, who of course, they also broke the Archbishop Vigano 11-page testimony as well. Archbishop Fisher's courageous and frank assessment of the synod offers the best insight to date because he was in the synod hall, and he was also a member of the synod's information commission. On a good note, he was also elected to the ordinary council of the synod. That's the council that prepares for the next assembly. But don't worry, it's balanced out by lots of bad characters too, so don't get your hopes up. He said the meeting, Archbishop Fisher said that the meeting was a curate's egg, good in parts, and welcomed the mood and the dedication shown to young people by the Vatican. But most of the interview was critical, in part regarding the machinations and omissions. They include a, quote, disappointing diffidence about the Church's moral teaching, an unwillingness to provide translations, and then almost all of the Synod Fathers felt, quote, shut down from speaking after they had given their interventions. He also expressed concerns with the Synod Assembly in its current form. Quote, in this Synod, we were writing doctrine, as it were, on the run, he said. This is not the way to make doctrine, end quote. So I'm going to go through a few of these elements of machination that Archbishop spoke about in this interview. First, Archbishop Fisher said that there's a real danger synods today can be used as vehicles for heterodoxy. Quote, this is not the way to make doctrine, he said. If you are preparing a Vatican document on a topic, you get a group of highly qualified theologians and experts in that area to do drafts and redrafts. You get others to critique it. You ultimately bring it to the bishops of the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Interestingly, because this final document is now under the new Synod rules there's an Apostolic Constitution that was issued in September. Some of you will be familiar with it. For those of you who are not, according to this new Apostolic Constitution, in Article 18, it says, if the final document is approved by the Roman Pontiff, then it becomes part of the ordinary magisterium of the successor of St. Peter. I think that's a direct quote. So that makes all of what's happening now in synods all the more, the concerns all the more heightened, because it's not just going to be, as it used to be, a a document containing suggestions for the Holy Father is given to him. But there's now the possibility, some would say that it's not illegitimate, that they've overstepped their bounds, but that document potentially could become part of the ordinary magisterium of the Pope. So that's good to keep in mind as we talk about this. Archbishop Fisher continued, the Pope may contribute in what would be a good writing process. The Pope may contribute at various stages along the way, and finally, it is his approval that gives the document real authority. It takes time, in my experience, usually several years, before a document is mature enough for publication as the faith of the Church. But in this synod, we were writing doctrine, as it were, on the run, with respect to synodality, in less than a week. We'll talk more about synodality in a bit. Fisher also said that synod fathers were wary of the way synods, quote, might be manipulated today, swept up in the fashions of the age. One example I'm going to get into in a moment is an attempt to smuggle in the loaded acronym LGBT into the final document. So there was also a word about, next a word about the secrecy and the shutdown inside the synod hall. Though there was less tension in the air this year, it was palpable. And it could be because the youth were there. There's a certain lightness that young people bring to any gathering. So there was, even though there was less tension, the youth synod was certainly more secretive than those in the past. About halfway into the synod, we discovered that the synod participants were bound to the pontifical secret, quote, inasmuch as it concerns opinions and individual votes. So this is regarding, they're put under the pontifical secret within the synod hall. In Article 9 of it's called the Regolamento, it's the rules governing the internal affairs of the assembly. Synod organizer said, quote, these dispositions serve to guarantee each synod father's personal freedom and to ensure due respect for both speaker and listeners. So that they sort of put the whole thing on shutdown in the name of communion, in the name of fostering confidentiality, et cetera, et cetera. I asked Paolo Ruffini, he's the prefect for the Secretary of Communications, and a good man from this past month's interactions. I asked him if the pontifical secret was in the Regolamento one day at the press briefing, and he told me no. I had a generally good impression of him, so I'll assume that he did not check. But even the synod organizers, some of them weren't even aware that this was in the document. Regarding discussions in the synod hall, Archbishop Fisher was asked if the bishops of Africa, who hold more to tradition and doctrine, and thank God for the bishops of Africa, I have to say, if they were shut down in the synod hall. Fisher responded, quote, no, I don't think it was just more traditionally minded who were shut down. We all were. The fact was that after our initial short speeches, these speeches are 4 minutes long, it was almost impossible for bishops to get a hearing in the General Assembly, end quote. Fisher said that the free discussions, quote, were very few, usually in the last hour of a very long day. For those of you, and you shouldn't be expected to know how a synod runs, very broadly speaking, it's in a sense now, under the current rules, it's divided into 3 parts. General congregations, the small group discussions, and free discussions. So in the general congregations, that's where all of the bishops are able to give a 4-minute intervention. They have to be submitted in advance, but they can speak about whatever they want. And in this case, the Pope said, which came in handy, I think, that they could change their mind if during the synod they thought that they should really speak about something else. So that's fine. So the general congregations, the small group discussions based on language groups, like the English group, they'll have 3 groups, Italian, they'll have 2 groups, etc. And then there are the free discussions, which should be a time of debate among the synod fathers on the synod hall floor. So what Archbishop Fisher is saying is that basically in this free discussion, the debate element of the synod, there was hardly any time. He says, on at least one occasion, he said, that time was taken up almost completely by speeches from ecumenical representatives. On other days, various announcements intruded. And when free discussion did happen, only cardinals and youth auditors were heard, no bishops at all. You got your little speech at the start, and that was about it, he said, when it came to the General Assembly. I was also told regarding, say, the small group discussions, that in one of the Italian groups, Jesuit Father Spadaro, who perhaps many of you will know, he was a papal delegate to the Synod. He's famous for saying 2 + 2 = 5. Anyway, he apparently dominated the discussion. And he's a priest, he's not even a bishop. He dominated this discussion in his small group circle to the point that the bishops were getting sick of it. So this also went on in a couple of the small group circles. So let's go into translations and voting, because this actually is, I think you'll agree, it's an important topic. The Synod organizers seem not to believe so. The lack of translations for non-Italian speakers was also an issue that came to the fore during the Synod. Concern about having proper translations of the final document before the vote was heightened, as I told you, by the fact that it could become part of the ordinary magisterium of the Pope. Last Saturday, the day of the vote, Archbishop Charles Chaput of Philadelphia, who's been very good and strong without this, said, quote, so this is the day they're voting, he said, quote, many bishops were frustrated by the lack of advanced translations for important issues that they were expected to vote on. As one of the Synod fathers argued, it's actually immoral to vote yes on significant issues if you can't even read and reflect on what the text says. Seems like a basic point, I don't know. I mean, this is all brain science here, folks. In his interview with Edward Penton, Archbishop Fisher said, some of the organizers seem to resent that at least half of the Synod fathers and nearly all of the auditors did not speak Italian. But the fact is that less than 1% of the world's population speaks Italian, with all due respect and love for both the Italian nation and people. Most of the bishops were there. A lot of them would speak Italian, but many of them don't. And so if the final document, it's only written in Italian, how are they supposed to read and reflect on what they're actually voting? Apparently we were told that the Synod drama came to a climax last Friday. So Saturday was the vote. Friday, it all hit the fan, apparently. A lot of you may know this story already, but Cardinal Lorenzo Baldessari, the Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops, I wish I had a photo, stormed out when the Anglophones and a few others were insistent on having translations of the text. He stormed out and he said, next time we're going to have it in Latin. Fisher, who was inside the Synod Hall, said the final document was read so fast that the translators struggled to keep up, and the fathers could not take notes in their own language. So we were not always sure what we were being asked to vote on, yes or no. He said any serious international meeting, and this point has been made by others, if this were a UN or a big company, would you actually have a meeting where you're having a serious vote and you haven't got the translation for your people who don't speak whatever language you're using in that? I mean, this is, again, these are not difficult points to reason to. He also said that, Fisher also said there were problems with the timetable and Synod rules that also left some of the bishops feeling manipulated. On multiple occasions, including on the evening after the vote, when the final document was presented to journalists, this was last Saturday evening at about 7:30 in the evening, the final document, it's after the vote, the Synod is basically over for all intents and purposes, and then we were given the document. I asked Paolo Ruffini, again, the prefect for the Secretariat for Communications, about the trouble that we were hearing about the translations. He said that Synod organizers underestimated how much time it would take last Saturday morning to read the entire document. And they only got through parts 1 and 2 before the morning's end. What was supposed to happen, according to the current rules, was last Saturday morning, they were supposed to read the entire document. The bishops received the final document only last Saturday morning in Italian. It was to be read in full in the Synod Hall with simultaneous translation the whole thing. And then they broke for the afternoon, so they would have a few hours to reflect on what they had just heard from the simultaneous translator, because they only had Italian in their hands. And then in the afternoon, they were to vote on the entire document. So that didn't happen. What happened was the Synod organizers underestimated the time it was going to take to read the document. They only got through part 1 and 2, so they took a break for lunch. They came back, they voted on part 1 and 2. They moved directly to part 3, which was the most, one of the most problematic sections. And then they went straight to the vote. So there was no time, this promised time for them to reflect, and it's not even in their native language. So I asked Paolo Ruffini about this, and that's what he explained. I asked him later, after the press conference, pressed him a little bit on the lack of time to reflect, and he said to me, quote, "The Synod Fathers have been here for a month talking about this. They are educated. If something is read to you slowly, it's not that you don't understand it." I mean, and he seemed like a good man, so I don't know who's feeding him. He's limited by what the Synod organizers tell him. Anyway, but of course, as we now know from Archbishop Fisher, the document wasn't read slowly, and of course, a bishop can't stop the translator in the Synod Hall to say, could you repeat that please? I didn't quite get that. But this leaves the burning question, why did the bishops vote on particular paragraphs if they didn't understand them? Why did they pass everything by 2/3 instead of abstaining or walking out and going to the media? Perhaps they ultimately trust in the hierarchy. Perhaps, and I love the Catholic Church, but the hierarchy in its current state, as you all know, has a few problems. Perhaps it's an easy way out. Perhaps they don't want to make waves in the hope that it will all get better. But as one Rome priest put it to me this week, quote, "People lie to themselves. It's one of the mysteries of human nature. Some look at reality and accept it even if it hurts. But a lot of people want to avoid saying the truth about themselves and others. And that's true for us all, not just the bishops." He continued, "They say it's not so bad, or maybe the Holy Spirit will make it work out this time." As though they're waiting for a miracle, instead of saying, we know based on past experience what they're going to do. And this is going to be the likely outcome. Nobody likes to say that, because then there are a whole host of other truths that implies and that you have to accept. This Roman priest continued. He said, "There are probably many things operating for a bishop to be a conformist," he said. One is these are the kinds of people who become bishops. They do this so that they can either be respected by their peers or be promoted. And then the other is, he said, sometimes people are just dumb and they're thinking about dinner. And then in others, these things are all operating at once. So let's move out. We'll move on to the final document. Just by way of a backdrop, to give you the way that, for those of you who, I know a lot of you are keyed in, but some of you are reading less, or I assume that. Maybe that's an unfair assumption. There was a 12-member drafting committee responsible for compiling the document. So this is these members of the Synod. Some are papally appointed. Many of them are elected according to geographical region. But it's worth noting that those principally involved in the writing process, remember the document's in Italian, so of course you're going to have Italians or somebody with a great knowledge of Italian writing it. There were 2 special secretaries for the Synod, so it's these 2 special secretaries who are principally responsible for writing it. One of whom is the vice president for the Carlo Maria Martini Foundation. And Martini is known, he was a cardinal from Milan. He's all about basically overturning all things. He's big into synodality, as we're seeing it now emerge in its current form, relaxing in priestly celibacy, etc., etc. And then, but it was among sources in Rome, what people were saying was that it was Archbishop Bruno Forte who was the real driver in writing the Synod document. Now, in case some of you are not familiar with or don't remember the figure of Forte, you'll remember that he was outed at the 2014 Family Synod by Cardinal Erdo of Hungary. It happened in a press briefing. for authoring the controversial passage on homosexuality contained in the midterm report. This is in 2014. And this midterm report, which contained heterodox language about homosexuality, was given to the press before the Synod Fathers even had a chance to see it. So this is the man who's on the drafting committee for the final document in the Youth Synod. How Archbishop Forte was permitted to even be appointed or elected, he was elected. He was a European member from Italy. Elected to it is beyond me, but there we are. Yeah, you can't really make it up. That's right. Well, believe me, there's so many novels and movies to be made. So, in his, going back to Archbishop Fisher's interview, he said that, quote, the final document is a significant improvement on the Instrumentum Laboris, and it's significantly the work of the bishops. He also said it was a significant improvement to the draft. The draft document, it was given to the Synod Fathers last Wednesday. That wasn't given to journalists, but I was given a leaked copy of it. So I can confirm that the final document is a whole lot better than the draft document. But it's very interesting because the draft document, and this could have been done in previous synods, I would have to check that fact. But seeing the draft document allows you to see more of what the drafting committee or those responsible for writing it really wanted to get into the document. That was then modified through amendments and resistance by some of the bishops. But the final document is definitely an improvement over the, I mean, we should really strive for more. This is the Catholic Church. We shouldn't just be we shouldn't have to settle for, oh, it was better than the draft document. But there we are. Even though it was an improvement in relation to the draft, and although the 249 Synod Fathers who voted on the document gave it a sustained round of applause after the voting ended, various paragraphs are causing concern, even if all obtained the requisites 2/3 majority. Each of the paragraph in the final document, they're all numbered, so it's not really paragraph by paragraph, it's number by number, because one number contained more than one paragraph. So each of those numbers is voted on individually. That's why it takes so much time. And they require a 2/3 majority in order to pass. So, but even though they all passed, there are several issues and concerns that have arisen. So I'm just going to very briefly go through that. First, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, but I just want to say this for now. It was clear synodality, and that might not mean too much to many people, so if synodality isn't sort of raising red flags for you, don't worry about it. It was clear that synodality was imposed on the Synod at the last minute. Edward Penton observed, perhaps the most ironic part, because synodality, the way that they were framing it, at least in the press briefings and in part in the document, synodality probably for Pope Francis and those Spadaro and company, would involve a greater listening. So we listen to the people. This language about the young people are going to teach us, even though you're a bishop who is supposed to teach, govern, and sanctify. Instead we have welcome, accompany, and accept. So anyway, this talk about listening to the group and then coming to decisions in that way, that's generally what is meant by synodality. So a sort of common consensus sort of way of proceeding. Edward Penton said, perhaps the most ironic part of the whole synod was that synodality was foisted on the synod in the most unsynodal of ways. This has only heightened people's concerns that those running these synods actually have little or no interest in synodality. They just want to push through the heterodox agendas. So the second point would be the Instrumentum Laboris. That's the working document, the original document that goes into the synod, and it was roundly criticized by many, but we won't go into that. But in the draft document, it said, I'll get into this later, but there were some heterodox things were contained in the Instrumentum Laboris, including the LGBT acronym. The draft document in the introduction to it spoke of language about the relationship between the working document, the Instrumentum Laboris, and the final document. and it's called a chapeau paragraph, I think. It's used in UN bodies and consensus documents. So in the introduction to the draft, they reference the relationship between the instrumentum laboris and the working document. They say that the two are intrinsically linked, and they have to be read in light of one another. What that does is you smuggle in that instrumentum laboris with all of its language so that it's really all accepted, even though you haven't said explicitly in the final document the things that it contains. So that was but the draft document actually, somebody got to them, because the draft document doesn't really speak of it being, the two documents being intrinsically linked. That language seems to be out. But there were certainly elements within the Synod that want to keep the instrumentum laboris alive, so that the final document retains the heterodox elements of it. Next, on to homosexuality. Fisher said that it's out of the final document, but the ambiguity remains, particularly with the praise of, quote, paths of accompaniment in the faith of homosexual persons. They're talking here about programs at the parish level. But what they did was, they failed to, oftentimes what you see is that it's a failure to distinguish. And this, let me just say this now, I was going to say it later. The shame of trying to get the LGBT into the document, the shame of all of this is that there are a lot of people who deal with this. A lot of young people now are dealing with it, and it's not because they were born that way, it's because culture is teaching them that there are all these options, and you can marry a girl or a boy, and it doesn't really matter, and I don't even know if I'm a girl or a boy, because I can just make that up myself. So the shame of all of this, I was going to say it later, but the shame is that the church is really the only one who has the power through divine grace and the truth through her teaching in order for people to be healed. People who have homosexual tendencies, that's the cross that they bear. We all have other things that only the church can heal. But let me just say that out now, that I think that is the big shame in this. There's another one I'm going to bring out, which is even more devious, but I'll save that for later. So the ambiguity about homosexuality remains in the final document, both because when speaking about these paths of accompaniment in parishes, it doesn't distinguish between courage, which does good work and is based on Catholic doctrine and true love, and then we have Father James Martin, which is a whole another realm. Another thing, the term sexual orientation, which is really the UN equivalent of LGBT, also made it into the final document once, although it was in quotation marks, which that would lessen its significance if you put something in, if you say LGBT or sexual orientation, for the reader that lessens its equivalence. In the draft document, it was in there 3 times without quotation marks. So sexual orientation was just one of the ways, was used several times in the draft. Okay. And the shame of this is that in the draft there was no mention of, there's a 1986 document by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, when it was run under Cardinal Ratzinger. They produced a document on the pastoral care of homosexual persons. And it's a beautiful document. All they had to do was get that out of the drawer and use it. But it wasn't even contained or cited in the draft document. It is in the final document, so that is an improvement. But still, there are these ambiguities. The other problem with sexuality issues was that the final document has a very problematic call for, quote, a deepened anthropology and theology of sexuality. That, it says, should be developed, the draft said, in a synodal style. I think someone got to them and didn't like the synodal language. So in the final document, they said that it has to be, this new deepened understanding has to be developed at all levels of society, of the church, etc. Meanwhile, what happened? Well, not everybody feels the same way about Pope John Paul II's theology of the body, but it isn't as though the Catholic Church isn't the mother of humanity and doesn't have a rich tradition in Christian anthropology, that man doesn't really change, and it applies for all times. But they're not interested in that. Again, okay, next problematic issue regarding women. The document speaks of a, quote, courageous cultural conversion and change in daily pastoral practice, unquote, that needs to be carried out. It says, and, quote, an area of particular importance in this regard is the presence of women in ecclesiastical bodies at all levels, even in positions of responsibility, and the participation of women in ecclesial decision-making processes. Now, there's a certain truth to this, and the church, say a consultor to a congregation or a consultor to the Vatican dicastery, there are many women who excel in their particular area of expertise, and women certainly can bring a lot in terms of the decision-making process in that way. But as one source close to the Synod said, this paragraph's reference to women being present in ecclesial bodies at all levels, he said, it, one, disrupts the apostolic nature of the church, represents a deep rejection of Christ's intentions for episcopal leadership, and undermines the spiritual fatherhood of priests. And I have to say, in terms of, I won't go on in this because there's plenty more to talk about, but I have to say, being at the Synod, there were so many bad parenting skills that were implemented throughout the Synod on the spiritual level, but I think a lot of it really comes down to the bishops and priests needing to be formed in that way, but then needing to be spiritual fathers. A spiritual father knows that he has to teach his children and to protect those who are entrusted to him. So a lot of it, I think, just comes down to that. Okay, next, there's a paragraph, number 146 in the final document, on Catholic blogs, that they're suggesting that they must be certified as Catholic. This appears to be a clear attempt to shut down opposition. So watch out, Michael, they're coming for you in the catacombs. And then, as many agree, the 60-page document is far too long, and in some places far too ambiguous. Archbishop Fisher called it long and convoluted, and he made it the very good point. This document should be for young people, and for those who are forming young people, who's going to read a 60-page? Someone said they exaggerated. They said, sort of a 300-page blubber document that has poison in it as well. And as one theologian said to me regarding the length, he said, it's like reading the minutes of the Supreme Soviet, tedious and enraging all at once. So Fisher also said that the final document lacks clarity on the church's moral teaching, which, don't young people need, we all need it, but don't young people in particular need the church's moral teaching? He said, quote, the drafter seemed uncomfortable, not just with particular teachings of the magisterium, but also with the methodology of the magisterium to date, and with the way it prized the practical intellect. I had the opportunity to speak with Cardinal Schönborn on a number of occasions during the Synod. And on one occasion, another journalist and I were putting some harder but fair questions to him. Your questions. That's what our job is to put your questions to them. And he encouraged us to see the Synod in a benevolent light, trusting that a meeting of bishops would come out to a good end. He also cautioned us against what he called an exegesis of suspicion. And while that's true, I immediately replied, though. I said, Your Eminence, I said, why should we trust the Synod process when Archbishop Bruno Forte is one of the main drafters in the final document? I think registered, but... So I don't know what you think about this, but on the topic of this hermeneutic of suspicion or exegesis of suspicion, as Cardinal Schönborn called it, last week at the end of the Synod, it suddenly occurred to me, because, and it's a fair point. Am I suspicious about everything? That can be something that you really have to look at your own heart, and it might need to be rooted out. So that's fair. But it occurred to me at the end of the Synod why there is this hermeneutic of suspicion. And it's because, it seems, tell me if you agree, that there's a hermeneutic of doubt and embarrassment about Catholic doctrine among the bishops. If they would just come out, then they wouldn't be suspicious. Let me give you just one example. This is, again, a lot happens, and although nothing happens in the press office, sometimes some things happens in the press office. So in one of the press briefings, because we have these 1:30 press briefings, it's at lunchtime, we have 1:30 press briefings every day after the morning session. It can get a little bit tedious. But at one of the press briefings, we had 3 members of the Anglicus B group. Now the Anglicus B group is one of these small groups. I think there was Anglicus A, B, and C. Someone joked to me, next time we'll have Hereticus A, B, and C. But anyway, there were 3 members of Anglicus B, including Cardinal Supich. And so on the topic, they were talking about, again, the pastoral care of, what I would say, the pastoral care of homosexual persons. But they were talking about welcoming and acceptance and accompaniment, and if I hear accompaniment one more time, I'm just gonna... but I asked them, I just said if they could say a little bit more and clarify what they mean by welcome, acceptance, and accompaniment. And I asked them, and this is just the way I asked them, I said, do you want to distinguish, when you say these things, are you distinguishing, yes, between welcoming and accepting people as eternally loved by God, which each of us is. He had us all in mind from all eternity, and one could contemplate that for the rest of one's life. So are you distinguishing between that and not accepting or welcoming the homosexual lifestyle? None of these 3 English-speaking bishops could bring themselves to actually agree with that. So excuse me for having a hermeneutic of suspicions, if that's what you want to call it. But just give us a little bit of clarity and there won't be any problems. And I have to say, the Synod Fathers who generally came to the press briefings, and I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to bishop bash here, because there are many fine bishops in the world. I'm just trying to highlight some of the issues. The Synod Fathers who came to the press briefings seem to be so lacking in confidence in church teaching or their duty as bishops to teach and form young people. Cardinal Tagle from Manila. You may have seen Michael's video from the catacombs. It's very funny. It's worth watching. Cardinal Tagle and others stressed over and over again that in this synod there were no ready-made answers, and that the synod wasn't about clarity. But as an aside, one of the Synod Fathers said off the record that Tagle got more applause than anyone at the conference, and that could be a useful indicator in the next conclave. So there's so much more that could be said, but I'll limit myself. Okay, so contrast this with one of the brightest moments of the Synod, a veritable rising star. Bishop Andrew Fuana of Cameroon. He was in a press briefing sitting next to Cardinal Marx, and he said in one of the press briefings, he said the reason why the churches in Africa are full with young people is because they hand on first because their culture still corresponds to the gospel, more or less. And he said with such earthy nobility, he said it's because they hand on the teaching of the church undiluted and uncontaminated. The good news is, along with Archbishop Fisher, Bishop Fuana was also elected for Africa to the Ordinary Council of the Synod, which decides what the next Synod is about. So that's good news. Just one other note, and that's on media during the Synod, and sort of media in general. Father Rosica, God bless him, and Father Spadaro, both with important rules regarding Synod media coverage. One of them, Father Rosica, every day at these 1:30 press briefings, Father Rosica was in the back, and Father Spadaro was in front. So they both have important roles regarding Synod media coverage. They seem insecure about any criticism. They keep blocking people on Twitter. often because they just can't take the reasoned blowback they get from the faithful. Someone asked me the other day, on Monday, they said, did you see what Father Spadaro tweeted out? I said, no, because he's blocked me. I mean, I don't think I've even ever said anything about the man on Twitter. I don't know, but I'm blocked. They call it a block party now. So people welcomed me. As Edward Penton said on this subject, he said, surely if they had bona fide arguments, they wouldn't need to block. And the faithful would be convinced. It reveals the bankruptcy of their own position. One Synod Father said, this is interesting too, a little bit of inside info. One Synod Father said that they were completely paranoid about the media, and they thought that all of us were out to get them. And that's why they invoked the pontifical secret. So the press briefings were also a joke to some of my colleagues. Father Ruzicka gave briefings for the first 3 days because he was supposed to be there giving briefings for the English journalists, but he then gave up after 3 days. Rarely did any of the Synod Fathers answer journalists' questions fully or satisfactorily. And as one colleague told me, it's a kindergarten. It's a sand pit. Where are the adults? He said, it's a theater in the press office. And what we need are more emperor has no clothes questions. So now I want to turn to 2 issues. I'm going to try not to take too much time. I want to turn to 2 more specific issues, and one is LGBT, that whole problem, and the other is going to be synodality. So having looked more generally at the Synod, I'd like to go in depth into these 2 areas. I covered the issue of LGBT pretty extensively for LifeSite News. It just seemed worth covering. And you may be aware that this was a big topic in the Synod, but I want to explain to you how this all went down. The whole matter emerged on June 29th, when Synod organizers, led by the General Secretary, again, Cardinal Lorenzo Baldessari, presented the working document at a press conference in the Vatican. Several journalists wondered why the LGBT youth phrase, which is language coined and used by the homosexual lobby, was in a Vatican document. The Church already has an excellent document on the pastoral care of homosexual persons, which I told you about. Baldessari said the phrase LGBT youth was taken from the pre-synodal document compiled by young people at their meeting with the Pope with Synod organizers in March of 2018. So Baldessari is saying the young people put it in there. He said we were just so diligent. He said we were so diligent about using the work of the bishops and using the work of the young people. And so the term LGBT youth, the young people inserted it into their document, and we just quoted it. So the next morning, I was sitting in my room, and I thought, I think I'll have a look at that document. So I did, and LGBT was nowhere to be found. Okay, so that's in June. So I don't forget if I wrote an article about that, but segue to October 1st. That's 2 days before the Synod is supposed to begin. So I went up to I didn't get called on, which Greg Burke was great about calling on everybody from all sorts of agencies, from Bondings 2.0 to LifeSite. I mean, we were all there and all called on, but this particular day he didn't. But afterwards, those who were on the panel often remained for a few minutes. So I made a beeline for Cardinal Baldessari, and I went up to him and I said that I looked in the document and it doesn't appear anywhere. And he said, it's not there? I said, no. So I asked Cardinal Baldessari if he would consider removing the phrase LGBT youth from the Instrumentum Laboris to avoid it becoming part of the ordinary magisterium, because according to this new Apostolic Constitution, there's a greater potential weight. He looked at me in Italian. He said, look, I'm not removing anything. He said the Synod Fathers will discuss it by article. So I wrote an account of what happened, just the facts and the exchange. So then October 4th, 1 plus 3 is still 4, even though 2 plus 2 equals 5. On October 4th, one day into the Synod, sorry, I'm tired folks, I've been working so much. Archbishop Chaput second day of the Synod, he used his 4-minute intervention to roundly criticize the use of LGBT and other similar language. So that could include sexual orientation, for instance, in any Vatican document. At a later press briefing, Paolo Ruffini, then sort of at the end, he noted that the LGBT reference made its way into he basically changed Baldessari's story. They probably told him to do so. He said that it made it into the working document because bishops' conferences and individual groups had submitted it. So no longer is it from the youth, but it's from bishops' conferences and from individual groups. So after the press briefing, I went up to him and I said, could you tell me which bishops' conferences and which individual groups they are? He said, well, I don't know, but let me find out, or else try to find out. But he didn't. He's got a lot in his mind, whatever. I didn't hear back. But, wait. But in the meantime, there's an interesting background, because at the same time there was an article that came out in Avvenire. This is the official newspaper of the Italian Bishops' Conference. So keep that in mind, because connect the dots, which are the bishops' conferences that are submitting LGBT. It turned out, according to this article, that the Pope's secretary to the C9 Council of Cardinals, his name is Bishop Marcello Semeraro of Albano. Albano is near Rome, part of Rome. He'd given a talk to the, quote, Italian Forum of LGBT Christians on the first weekend of the Synod. So while the Pope is meeting with the young people on October 6th in the Synod Hall and doing whatever they're doing, his secretary to the C9 is giving a talk to this LGBT group, this Italian Forum of LGBT Christians. Interestingly, Father James Martin was also a featured speaker by video message at this same conference. Without getting into all the details, what I uncovered by just looking into who this group is, and it's not, well, they are involved in it because they're the Italian affiliate, but what I discovered was that there's an international coalition of lesbian, gay, and transgender groups that were striving to, quote, in their own language, take advantage of the Youth Synod to pressure the Church to change her teaching on pastoral approach to homosexuality. This international LGBT coalition had been lobbying the Church since the first family synod in 2014. So there's a synod, there's a lobby that formed during the 2014 synod for this particular purpose. But in anticipation of the 2018 Youth Synod, it expanded into what is now collectively known as Equal Future. Its stated aim is to convince bishops of the, quote, damage done to young people as a direct result of the Catholic Church's anti-LGBTQ teachings and practices, end quote, from their own website. All this is on the internet. Equal Future unites radical US-based LGBT activists, such as Human Rights Campaign and GLAAD, with dissident Catholic groups, such as New Ways Ministry and Dignity, and this is who's lobbying the Youth Synod. One could argue that the greatest threat, though, comes from the handful of influential prelates who are either not being strong enough on doctrine or who are open to these sorts of things. So as the Synod went on, various voices emerged. We had Cardinal Tagle, again, say that he expected LGBT to be in the final document in some form. Meanwhile, it received pushback from the bishops of Africa, with Bishop Fuanya, again, of Cameroon, saying 99% of people in his diocese don't even know what LGBT is. We then learned that there was a plan afoot to smuggle in the LGBT acronym and ideology into the final document through the draft. And having seen a leaked copy of the draft, I can confirm that that's precisely what they did. So I told you about this introductory paragraph where they tried to sneak in the instrumental labores to link it to the final document in such a way that they're intrinsically linked. But the second way was through the sexual orientation language. Because for the homosexual lobby and the UN, LGBT equals sexual orientation. A good source noted, who would know about these things. In the end, as I said, the final document only used it once, sexual orientation, so there were some gains made. But I want to make one personal reflection on this matter, one personal comment. And again, I spoke earlier about the great shame of all of this is that the Church has so much in her grace and her wisdom, all divine power, and in the priesthood, in order to give everything people they need to be healed. Are any of us completely healed in this life? One hopes. but we all carry our own wounds and we're all broken in some way. But the church can reach us all, and we all have to remember our own poverty. But more importantly, do the bishops of the Catholic Church realize what's at stake here? If they do not stand strong against the homosexual lobby, given that there's an aggressive homosexual lobby seeking to indoctrinate the young through sexual education in schools, it will be another example of the men of the church not thinking about children. In my mind, it's enabling child abuse. And we've had enough of that. So lastly, synodality. Now I want to look, the LGBT was somewhat anticipated because we were already expecting that last June, but now we're going to look at one of the surprises of the Synod that has been raising concerns, and that was the last minute imposition of synodality in the final document, which in the draft, if you look at it, the whole third part, it's titled, it's all about synodality. And Archbishop Fisher, who was in the Synod Hall, said that synodality, and other Synod fathers have said this as well, even one of the members of the drafting committee from India, they said that synodality wasn't in the working document. It wasn't in the General Assembly discussions. It wasn't in the language group discussions. It wasn't in the reports from the small groups. It just appeared as if from nowhere in the draft final document. What I did hear from reliable sources was that synodality actually was on the list of possible topics for the Synod, but the ordinary Council of Synod, this body I told you about that decides what the topic of each Synod is going to be, they rejected it verbally, but they rejected it for the Youth Synod. So what we see is synodality gets rejected by the body that's supposed to organize the next Synod, and yet, boom, draft document, and the whole of Part 3 is about synodality. Fisher also said that there was some pushback from the Synod Fathers against this obvious manipulation. It meant some voted against the synodality paragraphs, not because they agreed with them. A lot of it's this sort of listening, we need to listen to everybody language, but because they disagreed with the ill-fitting paragraphs being intruded so late in the process and for no good reason. That's what Archbishop Fisher said. So while Pope Francis and others say synodality creates more listening church, which promotes involvement of all the faithful in church governance, and some bishops, even in the press briefings, would say that synodality also includes non-Christians and unbelievers and atheists, that we're in this great soup pot of synodality. So while they speak of it in terms of listening, some bishops, other prominent figures, see it as a means of decentralizing and democratizing the church and the magisterium away from the papacy and the Vatican to local churches. By doing so, they believe it makes it easier to introduce heterodox teachings into the church. Once synodality has been foisted upon them in the draft document, though after the draft document comes out, synodality is all in chapter, the third part. There was a counter document circulated among the Synod Fathers with 4 reasons to reject it. I won't go into the great detail here, but the 4 reasons were: 1, it's contrary to Catholic teaching and tradition. 2, the Synod structure proposed is Protestant, not Catholic. 3, synods are not infallible. And 4, synods will be weaponized to undermine Catholic doctrine and morals. So this is going around the Synod Hall in between the draft and the voting on the final document. This document also pointed out that synods can be heretical, such as the Synod of Pistoia, it cited, which was condemned as such by Pope Pius VI. He specifically condemned it for, quote, introducing troublesome novelties under the guise of a sham reform. And this is in the 1700s. And he said that it was convoked by bishops who were, quote, innovators in the art of deception. He also stated, in order not to shock the ears of Catholics, that the innovators sought to hide the subtleties of their torturous maneuvers by the use of seemingly innocuous words, such as would allow them to insinuate error into souls in the most gentle manner. Does it sound familiar? This week, after the release of the final document, I had the opportunity to speak with Cardinal Burke in Rome about the matter. He said that I asked him what the greatest danger of synodality is, And he said that in his view, it's the loss of the principle of unity of the church, which is the Petrine office. He said it introduces a Protestant principle into the church, despite the fact that the Pope would have to approve these documents. He'd have to approve them, but it'd be very difficult to not to approve it if you've set the system up in such a way that you're going to be listening to everybody. I asked Cardinal Burke if he believes we are now entering into a permanent synod. He said he suspects this is the case, quote, because obviously, he said, there are a series of issues that are on the table as far as the Pope is concerned, one of them being priestly celibacy. And I fully suspect that this synodality approach is going to be used to undermine the sacred discipline of the Church, end quote. I also had the opportunity to speak with Father Thomas Wynandy. You might know him. He somewhat famously about exactly a year ago, wrote an open letter to Pope Francis. Father Wynandy, I put the same question to him about synodality and the dangers of it, or his concerns and thoughts, to leave them open. He said, quote, the people who are working with Pope Francis want to ensure that no matter what happens at the synod itself, they get their way. And one of the ways that is ensured is if you bring up the topic of synodality. With synodality, while it seems to allow for all sorts of good things to happen, a great deal of freedom. So, a good thing. When it's actually being used for is to allow local dioceses or bishops' conferences to do things that the larger synod disapproves of. So what happens is that synodality, instead of being used in the manner in which it is intended to be used, is used in a manner it was never intended to be used. So I asked him to explain what synodality, because of course I said, how should it be used? He said synodality was always a concept to ensure that bishops from various regions were on the same page with regard to various doctrinal, moral, liturgical, or pastoral practices. So it united bishops. The gathering was to unite them so that they could more effectively present the doctrine of the church or decide a liturgical matter, say when Easter is going to be celebrated. But now what's happening, he said, is that the term is being used to allow for various divisions among various regions on doctrinal, moral, liturgical, and pastoral practices. And this is a misuse of what synodality is really supposed to be about, end quote. He added that such ecclesial behavior undermines the doctrinal notion of there being one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. But interestingly, I was a little surprised. He's clever. I asked Father Wynandy, I asked him if he thought it was a Protestantization, it would bring about that in the church. He said he wouldn't call it a Protestantization of the church, because that would be too positive. He said it's not that. I think he meant it in the sort of existential, that it's not about becoming something else. He said, rather, I think we're de-Catholicizing the Catholic Church. We're undoing its one holy Catholic and apostolic nature. I also asked Father Wynandy if he thought we were entering into a permanent synod. He said he has no idea what that would mean, but he added that he thinks, quote, this pontificate is using these synods to promote things that he himself as pontiff can't do. And so he uses the synods and the notion of synodality to get others what he cannot do, to get others to do what he cannot do. He said, quote, this pontificate likes ambiguity and porous language because when people can interpret these, because then people can interpret these ambiguities in many divergent and contradictory ways. One of the ways it can be interpreted is the way in which the pontiff really wants it to be interpreted. And everyone knows, of course, which way that is, though he never has explicitly and clearly stated it. Just on one side note about this whole synodality and such, and my colleagues and I during the synod, we've often heard the phrase, the synod is not a parliament. And even Pope Francis, in his final remarks for the synod, he talked about just three things. One of them was the great accuser, and another of them, he said again, it's not a parliament. So from the short time I've been covering the Vatican under this pontificate, if they repeat something over and over again, you can be certain it's the opposite. So finally, I just want to say one word about, because I think since we're here in the United States, with the McCarrick revelations and everything that's been going on in terms of the sexual abuse cover-up, I'm from Pennsylvania, so when I came home in the summer, so I'm going from the heart of the storm to the heart of the storm. So I wanted to ask some informed sources about the February meeting that the Pope has called in Rome, where he'll meet with the presidents of bishops' conferences about sexual abuse. I asked Cardinal Burke what his view was on the February meeting. And remember, Cardinal Burke was the head of the Apostolic Signatura, so he's a jurist and knows the church's law well. He said, quote, "The fact of the matter is that the church has a discipline in place, which she's had in place for centuries, for dealing with these kinds of crimes, these kinds of grievous sins. They didn't just come into being in our time. What needs to be done is the church's discipline with regard to ecclesiastical crimes, and their punishment has to be studied once again and made accessible, and it has to be applied. Now they come with all kinds of theories, that it's clericalism that causes priests to abuse children, that there aren't enough women in seminary formation. Whoever talks about the fact that these are grievous sins? This is lust, and it cannot be in the sacred ministry, and we need to root it out. And especially this has to be made clear that most of these sinful acts are homosexual acts." That's what Archbishop Vigano said in his third statement, which many consider was the best. He spoke very bluntly about a homosexual culture in the episcopacy and the clergy being the root cause of the abuse. I actually put that question to Cardinal Supich in one of the press briefings during the Synod, just to see what he would say. I asked him if he thought it would have any impact on the Synod, and he said he really didn't realize, he didn't know what was new about the third testimony. He said, but if you look at the research, of course, he cited the John Jay report. He said it shows that homosexuality isn't the root cause. Well, the John Jay report concluded that homosexuality wasn't the root cause, but it stated that the findings were that over 80% of the people who were abused were adolescent boys. You can't tell me that's not those are homosexual acts, so how can you not say that homosexuality is not one of the root causes, at least? So on the February meeting, I put the same question to Father Wynandy. He said he isn't sure what to think about the February meeting, but he said, what I do know is that if the bishops focus on clericalism, you then know it's not going to amount to much. If they actually take up the major problem in the church, that of active homosexuality among the clergy and bishops, then you know they're serious. But if they hide behind clericalism, you know they're not serious. If they're actually willing to take up the topic of homosexuality, homosexually active priests and bishops, you know they're serious. So just a word in conclusion. We're moving deeper and deeper into the progressive jungle, folks. And most people that I have talked to believe that it's only going to get worse. The crisis is probably just going to get worse. I also asked Cardinal Burke how he would diagnose the spiritual ailment that's afflicting the church now. And he said, I think we're in the middle of an apostasy, which he said before. And the only remedy is a return to the constant doctrine and sound discipline of the church. That's how Christ comes to us in tradition. But I think we're fully in an apostasy. He said a little bit about what he means about that. He said this idea of going out to the world without a clear identity and accommodating ourselves to the world amounts in the end to an apostasy. He said we have situations like the accord with China, where we're calling into question the heroic sanctity of heroic confessors and martyrs of the faith. That's just one example. Or, for instance, the relaxed discipline regarding communion for those who are in irregular unions. We're reducing to meaninglessness the heroic fidelity to marriage commitments of people whose spouses have abandoned them over the centuries. Really, a mundane and worldly spirit has entered into the church, and it has to be purified. And he said he thinks Satan is on the rampage these days. So what is going to change this? He said, one source said to me last week, he said, quote, not one of the cardinals is willing to put his red hat into an envelope, put a Vatican stamp on it, and send it off to Santa Marta with no return address. He said, Pope Francis is like a chess player who changes the rules during the game and then wonders why no one will play with him. And the synods are more and more secretive with rules that far surpass the Chatham House rules. But as Cardinal Burke pointed out to me, the church has everything necessary to heal the crisis. We do need a supernatural intervention. We don't know what form that's going to take, but we also need to remember that in the end, the Immaculate Heart of Mary will triumph. So thank you for your time.